Hello and welcome to CSA's webinar series, CSA Cloud Bytes. Today's webinar, sponsored by Fugue, is titled Transforming Enterprise Cloud Security to Supercharge Developer Velocity. A few housekeeping items before we start. Please enter your questions at any time during the presentation by using the question tab at the bottom of your screen. We have reserved time toward the end of the webcast to address your questions. Additionally, the slides from this webinar are not provided, but you can check out the attachments section for more resources as well as a link to register for an upcoming webinar. You can also access this recording at any time by using the same link to rewatch the webinar again or share it with a colleague. Today we are joined by Rajat Sharma, co-founder of CWS. He has primarily worked in the information technology sector for over 10 years, specializing in delivering cost-effective, innovative solutions to his customers in the cloud. Rajat enjoys implementing and creating cutting-edge technologies in the telecommunications, banking, and IT verticals. His background is in business technology management and has specialized in cloud architecture, cloud security, and cloud application development. Also joining us is Josh Stella. Josh Stella is co-founder, CTO, and CEO of Fugue, the company transforming cloud security to help teams move faster and stay secure. Through Fugue's masterclasses, Josh educates cloud and security professionals about cloud misconfiguration exploits and how to keep cloud infrastructure secure from attackers, often by demonstrating exploits in real time as a white hat hacker. Previously, Josh was a principal solutions architect at AWS, where he supported customers in the area of national security. Thank you all for joining us, and we're excited to have you here. Now I will turn things over to Drew Wright, co-founder of Fugue, to help moderate today's presentation.
Thank you, Brooke. Appreciate that. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. We are glad you are here. Hope this will be a fun and insightful session. We've got some slides here, but this is not going to be a slideshow session. This is going to be a conversation primarily between Josh and Rajat. Let's get to the agenda here really quick. So we first want to kind of take a step back and look at the cloud and think about security a little bit differently, and explore sort of where we're seeing a lot of enterprises and security teams kind of get some things wrong in the cloud, and how that can hold back innovation and the ability for developers to do their work in a timely fashion. And in preparing for this, we've all kind of boiled down what we feel is sort of 5 fundamental kind of strategic action steps that every enterprise can take to transform how they're doing cloud security, how they're approaching it, so they can move faster and do cloud security more efficiently. And then we'll get to Q&A. At any time, if you have any questions, please do pop those into the chat. So what I first wanted to do before we start really diving into this is kind of take a look at the topic of this, which is really transforming cloud security to supercharge developer velocity. And what that got me thinking is has the role of security in the enterprise changed with the cloud? Because typically it's, the role of security is to keep things secure, and developers is to develop applications, and we've all kind of got these sort of siloed roles. Is that really the case now in the cloud? I'll put this one over to Josh first. What is the role of security in cloud?
Oh boy. So I would argue that the role of security writ large, well, I'm going to say something that is perhaps kind of silly sounding, but the role of security is to make secure things, right? The role of security is to make and keep things secure. So the important question there to me is less what is the role of a security practitioner of a particular variety, and more how can you build stuff in cloud that is secure and that remains secure. And I think that what we see, and this is kind of all I've done for about a decade, is that cloud security is primarily architectural. It is primarily the design of the system, both in terms of preventing hacker penetration, but perhaps more important, limiting hacker blast radius. So I view that the role of the security team as typically being two things in the cloud era. It looks like I'm holding up 5 fingers. One is to provide guidance to DevOps and developers on how to build things in a secure way. And the other is, once they're built and deployed, making sure they don't drift from a secure configuration.
Yeah, totally. And just to expand on that, I have a little bit of a different perspective, I guess, because I don't come from a traditional security background, so I get to see from this development flow how security has an impact on development, right? And I think that when we talk about cloud security, I think a lot of the traditional concepts still apply, but I think that security teams today should also be focused on how their jobs and how what they do on a day-to-day affects the delivery of product at the end of the day. I think that security, especially in the cloud space, needs to be more aware of development life cycles and how development products that are being created get into production, how they can expedite that or make it so that the velocity is increased for getting into production. I think that's a big part of security today, because creating products doesn't mean that you get to do security on day one and then call it a day. Like Josh is saying, I think that drift is important, and making sure you can account for that drift very quickly.
As you were talking, we talk a lot about this at Fugue, that the goal is to the goal in building software typically is either to create top line revenue for a business or other kinds of revenue for a business, maybe greater efficiency, or for a government organization, mission fulfillment. People don't write software to write software, and people don't secure software to have secure software. They do all this in the service of the business function. And so do we. Of course, Fugue being focused on security, the overlap is very strong for us. And so the security team, and I hear this a lot. And by the way, I'm not a security engineer per se by background. I'm a developer / software architect who's worked a lot in national security environments where building secure stuff is given a high value. The role of security always has to be in service of that broader organization mission. Bumped my mic. Generating revenue, fulfilling mission, etc. And speed is now absolutely critical to that. So in the past, I think security has thought of themselves as kind of a necessary friction, and you see a lot of kind of I don't know if complaints or a lot of acknowledgement that they are perceived that way from security practitioners on Twitter, etc. The good news is, with automation and API-based infrastructure, security teams can actually speed things up, and that's something that you were saying there. So I very much agree with that.
Yeah, totally.
So when we've traditionally, I think, always kind of seen that point of friction between security teams and developers. The developers need to move fast. The business is putting a lot of pressure on them to move fast, but it's typically the security team saying, "Whoa, slow down. There's no way we can possibly certify that all of this is secure before you go deploy it." And that's not a tenable situation anymore. But in the cloud, we have ways of addressing that. That we no longer need to have these kind of gatekeepers that review things before we deploy them. We can use automation. We can use things like policy as code to help developers, from the start. Is that fair? That the role of security is now more of a facilitator as opposed to kind of a gatekeeper or a team that kind of ensures things are secure after the fact?
Yeah, like I have a lot of thoughts on that actually. Primarily because I've lived the life of security being that gatekeeper, and I've been there to modify that into how security teams can go from being gatekeepers to being kind of just validators in the end, but not really having to be that stop here, let me do my job for X amount of weeks or months before you can get product into production. I think that with the modernization of the cloud and with, like you mentioned, policy as code, we're able to take a lot of the components that security, depending on what type of security job it is, but take a lot of their components that they do on an auditory basis, I guess, at the end of a release cycle, and kind of implement that early on in the development or the software development life cycles, right? And I think I fundamentally believe that policy as code in relation to organizational policies, to security policies, to policies that you might even have, that are not inherently related to organization or security, are fundamentally important for how quickly you can get product into production. If you can take policies and take practices into software development life cycles and have them kind of on this stage-based process, and go through each step instead of doing it at the end, you're going to increase that velocity. And I think that's kind of where the shift is coming from.
Oh, yeah. So let's. This is a good place to kind of bring some focus. So Rajat, you and CWS, having worked with you guys for a number of months now, your perspective, primarily as I see it, helping large kind of enterprises in the financial services and telecom space specifically, that are operating under pretty intense security requirements and regulatory requirements, and need to get critical applications out the door, ship them quickly. Let's see. And do that in a secure way, fast. Yeah. What are some common kind of challenges that you're running into that causes them to reach out to teams like yours to help them get this done? What challenges are they facing, or where are they kind of tripping over themselves and sort of failing to deliver these kinds of applications in a timely fashion?
Yeah, I think that resonates actually quite well with the question that you had before, really around policy as code, because that aids in that. But I think where we really see a lot of large enterprise customers kind of tripping over themselves is, for me, the way that I look at it, it's a process problem. I think that a lot of large organizations have this kind of legacy ways of working where they take a lot of the practices that they have in the traditional spaces and in private data centers, on premise sites, and they try to apply that and apply the same processes to the cloud. And I don't think that works. I think it doesn't work because it adds a lot of overhead, and it's not focusing on one of the primary problems of the cloud, which is not these large scale. Okay, well, how do we measure network traffic? How do we measure intrusion detection? How do we measure anomaly detection? All those things. I think really it's about how you create and manage your cloud. And a lot of these larger organizations can't achieve that velocity because they take these traditional concepts that they have and they try to implement it in the cloud. But I think even more than that, a lot of it also has to do with education. I think that from a process point of view, if you don't properly educate your developers and your security engineers and whoever it might be on how to get product to the cloud efficiently, and making sure that you embody a lot of the new characteristics and the patterns that exist in the cloud, you're going to find yourself not only tripping over yourself from point zero to kind of that point one of getting into the cloud, but you're going to find yourself doing that on a lot more than just your development lifecycle. I think it's going to start impacting the morale of your developers. I think that looking at it kind of in that perspective is interesting.
Boy, we're going to keep agreeing on things, it seems, but hopefully I'll bring some additional and alternate perspective to the same thing. So I'll start backwards on the morale of the developers. Developers have become this incredibly hot commodity in the current labor market, right? I mean, we've all seen it. It has never, I've been doing this for longer than I want to remember, but it's never been like this before in terms of the premium put on developers. So the first thing you have to know is that your developers have options. And so, in other words, they don't have to work for you. They can go somewhere else. It's an incredibly good job market. And what developers want, and what your organization honestly should want as well, there's a reason developers want it. It's not selfish, is to keep up with the velocity of modern software development. Just like developers don't want to see a Microsoft project Gantt chart for a waterfall implementation, right? They want to do agile development, and I mean, I don't know that they love Jira, but they don't want the Gantt chart, right? The old school way. Well, when you think about cloud development, one of the great big friction points prior to cloud to velocity was the frequency at which you shipped releases of software. Yeah. And in the past, commercial software sometimes shipped 4 times a year, sometimes major releases 2 times a year, or even slower. Mm-hmm. At Fugue, we put our SaaS online in January of 2019, and we're on version 67. We ship every 2 weeks. So as you're thinking about that as it relates to security, it means that security must be automated because there's just no way that you can ship every 2 weeks or even every month and do manual processes for security. And you shouldn't want to either, because it's kind of like the Terminator movie, right? Like, you're not going to beat the automation, right? And the bad guys, the hackers, are using automation. So, so not only are you going to be frustrating your development team, frustrating the business units that want to ship with frequency, but you're also going to lose. And that's not fun for anyone.
Yeah, I thought I'd throw this slide up, which I think hits on why you can't rely on trying to kind of detect intrusions and stop them in their tracks when they're in progress. You really have to prevent the misconfigurations that enable the attacks to happen in the first place. And so I know you've talked about this a bit, Josh, sort of the traditional hacker strategy versus the cloud strategy, and how it kind of flipped things on its head, and how dangerous it can be, to even leave a critical misconfiguration in the environment for, minutes or no longer than an hour per se, right?
Yeah, that's right. Mark Andreessen famously said software is eating the world. And that's true. So if the hackers are employing this kind of automation where they have, networks of machines all over the planet searching everything you're putting on the internet for vulnerabilities as soon as that IP address lights up, and it's minutes typically, not hours. If you're not employing policy as code, and people think of sometimes policy as code as it's almost kind of like a too constrained a term in a way. What we're really talking about is security automation as a part of the normal operations of the system. So we say policy is code because security concepts are typically expressed as policies, things you're allowed and not allowed to do. But what policy as code does for you, and Rajat, I love that you brought up education. As a developer, I have learned more by making mistakes and having my compiler tell me where I'm dumb than I have by sitting in any classroom. And one of the beautiful things about policy as code is it acts that way. So when you make an error in your code, if you use Fugue or our open source project Regula, it is going to immediately tell you, you messed this up and here's how. And so that's a very natural way for developers to be educated without taking time away from productive hours.
Yeah, and I know you want to jump in, Raj, and we actually had a question coming from the audience that was, how can we best train our developers on how to do things securely? And I think that's kind of what we're talking about here, which, I guess probably both of you would say it's not really as much about like formal training for developers to do things securely. It's about giving them tools that help them do things securely and tell them when they aren't. And then I know Rajat, you talk about kind of security awareness as a byproduct of doing this correctly.
No, I think that's a huge part of it. And I know that, so I'm going to keep feeding off of this conversation and all the historical conversations we had, but I remember Josh mentioning, one time that, okay, you have, for every X amount of developers you have one security engineer. And if you think about that concept more and more and more, you realize, wait a second, how do we actually secure our environment and secure our entire organization, knowing that fact that we have 10 developers for every software for every security engineer.
It's one security engineer for every 10 DevOps engineers for every 100 application developers.
There you go.
That's kind of the ratio.
Yeah, and I think that the active approach to learning, which is, okay, well, you take your development team, you tell them, all right, let's go get the certificate, everybody. Let's spend some months together. We'll get the certificate, and we're all going to be developers that are security aware, and we're going to make better code. But I think, just to feed off Josh even more on this, I think the reality is, and about developers, is that if you can give them tools early on in the SDLC for them to learn passively, you're better off than in my opinion, with the traditional education side of things. I think that developers, as of today, love the idea that their linting tool will tell them you're wrong. And the senior guys, the reason why they're senior, the senior developers, is because they remember every single time that they were wrong, and they don't code like that anymore. And I think that for developers to be security aware, they need that exact mechanism in place as early as possible. And that's why policy as code is extremely effective for that.
Yeah, I completely agree. I would piggyback on the junior v senior thing. Every senior developer is in many ways just a developer who's learned that they're not as good as they thought they were when they were a junior developer. In other words, that as you do this stuff, you find out that these are very complex topics. It's a constantly moving target. Technology is constantly evolving really, really quickly. So the ability to be an autodidact, to teach yourself, is probably the central skill. And senior folks they don't want a false sense of satisfaction that, my code ran, therefore it's okay. No, they know that when that goes they need code that is debuggable and even understandable by the next programmer who picks it up, and that is secure, among many other vectors. And the maturity of a development organization often can be kind of measured in that way. And by the way, we're huge fans, and I'm personally a huge fan of getting very early stage developers, or even non-developers, and teaching them how to code. One of our at Fugue, one of our folks who's the deepest expert in the company on OPA and Regula, not necessarily like writing compilers for that stuff, which we do too, but authoring that information, came here as a tech writer. And she's just super smart. So,
Wow.
And that OPA, Open Policy Agent, which is a policy as code framework that's sponsored by the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. Definitely recommend if you haven't exposed yourself to that project, by all means do so. I'd say we all probably agree that policy as code needs to be the foundation of any cloud security effort, and Open Policy Agent is a fine project to kind of take a look at and consider.
Yeah, just one last point on that. We're focusing a lot, I think, correctly on the effects of policy as code in the shift left part, the early part of the SDLC. The beauty of policy as code, if it's done properly, at least in our opinion, this is how we've done it at Fugue, because we think this is the useful way to do it. Those same policies can be run against the deployed runtime environment to check it for correctness. So it's not just about that teaching developers and getting it right up front. It's about maintaining correctness and being aware of errors in the running environment as well with policy as code.
Yeah, let's take a look at that kind of, because we've talked about process and policy as code, but let's take a look at kind of like how and where that gets applied in the software development lifecycle, because cloud infrastructure has a development lifecycle, just like application development has its own kind of development lifecycle. So let's talk about that, because we've got a kind of a development stage, deployment stage. We have the runtime. Often that's a production environment. It might be a runtime kind of dev environment as well. But where should we start with this, Josh, in kind of like picking apart sort of how security teams should be thinking about this life cycle and how to secure it?
So I'm going to comment very briefly on this and kick it over to Rajat, because for the past number of years, I've been living this inside of Fugue. Of course, we ship software all the time, but we're a relatively, we're a startup. We're a relatively small team compared to the kind of enterprises that Rajat is working with and advising. I think if you're thinking about greenfield, start on the left here. If you're thinking about building new stuff, start on the left. If you already have stuff deployed in the cloud, you probably need to start from both edges and work to the middle, because you've got a bunch of stuff out there that you didn't catch the security errors in dev, so they're living in your prod or your staging or dev environments. We have a class on why hackers like to go after development environments. But you're running infrastructure. So use the policies there to see if you have made mistakes, and you almost certainly have. Almost everyone does. And I say almost, to my knowledge, everyone does. But when you're building new stuff, you do want to catch it early. The deployment part tends to involve, and by the way, both of those edge parts, the left and the right, can be done without employing much in the way of like integrations into your SDLC. You can kind of do it pretty quick and easy. The middle one actually is where you're going to hit a lot of the integrations with the CI/CD pipeline. So there's typically, processes to work out and so on.
Yeah, no, definitely. And funny enough, dealing with a lot of large enterprises, I think that as much as we want to believe that large enterprises have, this boatload of money, so they're so advanced and they're better than everybody else, I think the reality is that that's not true. Anybody that's been working in the space for a while knows that that's not true. When we deal with a lot of our clients kind of in the enterprise space, usually when we come into it, they already have a product lined up. It's already in production. What we're coming there to do is either optimize, do some type of change in their environment, migrate from one environment to the other, where we're more on the production side of things, right? And I think it's unrealistic for a large organization, or any organization really, to say on day zero, we have nothing in our SDLC, and on day one, we will. I think the closer reality is, okay, on day zero, we don't have stuff in our SDLC, and on day one, let's start looking at our environments. Let's understand what is going on in these cloud environments that we have. Because if you can change one thing in your process as a large organization, I would tell you to change one thing. If today you have no, security at a cloud level, at least early on in your SDLC, make sure you can do the audit and reporting part very, very well for your environments per release. If you can do that, you've won a major battle. If you can say today as a developer and application team, hey, this is our application. We passed all these assessments from a code level, and hey, this is our development environment, our test environment, our UAT environment, and this is what our posture is against all these different frameworks that exist in the market, like ISO 27K and all these other acronyms that make you feel really, really good about your environment. If you can do that, you've succeeded on day one. And I think the next evolution of that is, okay, now that we understand what we're doing wrong in these environments, and we're able to capture that, let's start to fix this. Go back to your development side of things. Okay, we have this infrastructure that we spun up manually. Fine, make it as infrastructure as code. Now take what you've learned from your production environments and what you're doing wrong in all these environments that you have pre-prod, and apply that to the development side when you're actually creating this infrastructure. And then slowly you'll start to realize that the deployment side, on that day 3 becomes a lot easier because you have all of this in place.
That's a really great point, and one I've actually never thought about, which is your deployed infrastructure is going to educate you on what you should care about in dev. And at Fugue, we've tended to think about it as kind of one domain. And I think that's benefited our customers in that, a single policy in Fugue can work on all sides of the equation. But I'm gonna steal that, Raj, when I'm talking to customers. That's a good way to figure out what you care about, I suppose.
Yeah.
I mean, I would imagine, though, to get good at being able to kind of automate the certification or audit process of a staging environment, let's say, to get the green light to deploy to production, you probably have to be able to be really good at understanding your production environment and the security posture of that environment. And I think that's something that we see, organizations really struggle with. It's one thing, the greenfield application is like such a perfectly awesome kind of use case, because you get to start fresh and do things correctly from the beginning. But a lot of organizations, they're like, that's great and we'll do that, but we've got this big mess right now on our hands, this massive cloud environment. Maybe it spans cloud providers, and we don't really know what we've got running. We don't really know what the security posture of that is. Where do we start? Like, how do we make sense of this, of what feels like a big mess on our hands? And so we can go to the CISO or the CIO or CEO and say, this is where we stand. This is what we've got running. This is where we're compliant. This is where we aren't, but we know everything. Right now, it's kind of scary because a lot of those teams can't answer that question of what's running and what the posture is. John, Raj, why don't you take that first?
Yeah, no, I think that's it's a harsh reality, really, because when you think about how enterprises evolve, and I'll speak actually predominantly for a large enterprise here, you don't have a single cloud account. You have multiple. You have multiple teams all around the world that have their own hyperscaler subscription, whether it's AWS, GCP. I don't really cloud discriminate, whoever it might be. And you have multiple accounts all over the world. And if there's somebody that says, okay, there's always going to be somebody that needs to do an audit. And that person is going to say, well, we have 30 different cloud accounts. I don't know what's going on, really. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to every single team and I'm going to ask them directly, what are you doing and why are you doing what you're doing? Give me a report. And they're going to figure that out. And this manual process will probably take them about a month by the time all the emails go back and forth, and they'll figure it out. I think the harsh part about that is that by the time you figured it out, the environment has changed. Which sucks because you've done all this work. So when you really look at how you should be capturing what's going on in the cloud, especially when you have that cloud zoo, I think the big part is identification. You need to have a tool in place to be able to identify your assets. What assets do you currently have? how are they configured and how are they being used? Which the how are they being used far extends, I think, policy as code. But I think the understanding how these resources are being used from an internal point of view and an external point of view from a user perspective is extremely important for cloud security. I think that's one of the big things. And with the Cloud Zoo, identification is one of the hardest things to do. Having a tool for that is one of the best things, especially if you have a poly-cloud environment or a multi-cloud environment.
Everything you're saying absolutely rings true again. Of course, software is constantly changing. Of course, these deployed environments are constantly changing. And that's a reality of the world we live in. And what that means is audits. What does an audit do? It tells you, however deep the audit is, it collects some amount of data about a moment in time in the life of that system. That's what it tells you. A lot of times in the certification and accreditation processes and with audits and so on, the human processes are interrogated a lot. Like, are your processes good enough, etc. I think someone might disagree with me, but humans never perfectly follow processes. So that has value in that it will tell you if you're like really missing something, but you should assume that those processes are not actually going to be fully protective. At the end of the day, the actual state of the running software and infrastructure is what you should know and care about. 90% of hacking is discovery, and 90% of prevention is knowledge. Both knowledge of the state of things and also knowledge of what's dangerous, and the kind of merger of those two things. Drew, you made an interesting comment about like knowing what you have. The average enterprise software system or commercial software product is very, very large and has lots of components. I would argue that a moderate to large application has more components, and I don't mean separate services. I'm talking about the algorithms, the logic, and the data that are used. Probably has more components than an aircraft carrier. Well, if you imagine an aircraft carrier, you have one, but you don't know the torque setting on every bolt in every bulkhead at any moment in time. Well, the beautiful thing about cloud is we can know that. We can interrogate that. So you have an aircraft carrier, but you don't know the state of it. In the past, pre-cloud, before we had APIs on all these things, we knew we had a system, but we could not know actually the full state of it. And the beautiful thing about cloud is you can. So one of the things I like to tell CISOs and CEOs and so on, a lot of times they get asked questions whenever there's a big breach in the news, and they'll say, "What should I do first?" And I say, the first thing you should do is go to either your security or DevOps team and ask for a report on all of the cloud configurations and misconfigurations in all of your cloud environments and give them an hour. And if they can't do that, it means they don't know. Okay, if they say I need a week, that means that you could have asked them at any given hour and they wouldn't have known then either. Okay, so that means they're missing that environmental awareness.
Yeah, I think that sort of brings us to the kind of the 5 fundamentals, or maybe a good way to look at it is sort of a strategic set of actions that any enterprise cloud security team should take to kind of undertake this transformation, which I think is really as much about helping developers move fast, improving that developer velocity without breaking the bank, without having to field an army of cloud security engineers to throw them at this problem. You probably can't afford to do that. and it probably won't help keep your environment secure to begin with. You need some, you need a different path. You need that automation with policy as code. So let's let's start with one again a little bit more. Know your environment. I don't think this isn't like a linear process. These are all 5 of these things are essentially things that you need to be doing, concurrently. But when it comes to knowing your environment, that question you asked Josh of, go tell us, where we're in, where the misconfigurations are. What questions should we be asking about our environment? Is it who owns what? Where's the secure data? What kind of workloads are we running? Like what are the questions that we need to ask to begin to start to think about transforming cloud security? Raj?
Yeah, so the interesting part about this question is that the whole idea about knowing your environment, I think that one, the ideas of actually being able to have that asset inventory that we talked about a little bit before, right? I think a big part of it as well, which I think is one of the main things, is that you can achieve compliance but not true security, risk-free environments. The good thing about knowing that is that you need to know your asset inventory, understand what you have in the cloud, but furthermore, understand why you have it. You could be completely compliant and have all these compliance frameworks in place and know that, okay, we scan against everything and we know everything is great. But that doesn't mean that, let's say, an internal resource that doesn't need to be there is still there. So are you truly security compliant having still that mess in place, right? So I think that the reality of knowing your environment is truly being able to identify, right? Identify what you have and why you have it.
Yeah, again, I agree. We very often see one of the fun parts of my job is whenever there's a breach in the news, I'll go try to recreate it in a sandbox if I have enough detail to do that, a cloud breach. Very, very often, the initial point of penetration is what we call orphaned resources, stuff that you don't need that's still running. And when you look at the aggregate attack surface left out there by these orphan resources, a single forgotten about virtual machine EC2 instance or VM that you're not patching, its attack surface grows daily. So this is even if you were to add nothing to your environment, and we at Fugue, we manage millions of cloud resources for our customers. We have customers with 1,000 or so cloud accounts and hundreds of thousands of resources in them. When you look at an environment like that and you say, well, what if every cloud account had 5 orphaned compute instances, and you think about that amount of attack surface, that's why hackers go for it. So yeah, identifying and having the detailed knowledge of that is absolutely critically important. Hey, Drew, I just want to ping you. There's a whole bunch of questions coming in, just so you know.
Yeah, and I'll just hitting on that orphaned resource thing, and we'll get to some of these questions. Is if a resource is an orphaned resource, that means you're probably not scanning it, for vulnerabilities or for misconfigurations, because it's missing from your management systems to begin with. So that's pretty scary.
Well, it might be. So I'm going to challenge that a little and paint an even darker picture. So so let's say you have an orphaned resource, and it's not it doesn't have some like egregious misconfiguration, right? So very often, very often, the way you look for cloud misconfigurations and the way you're tracking, for example, patch levels of operating systems, that those are often done in different management tools. So, and there's good reason for that, by the way. You really don't want to provide perfect insight into all aspects of a computing environment requires a great deal of permissions for the automation. So you probably want some separation of concerns there, and very often that's true. Mm-hmm. So it is not uncommon, for example, for the patch management system or the system that is examining, the operating system patch levels to have forgotten about something, but for it to be showing up every time there is a report from the cloud service provider about what you're running. So it's telling you it's there. The problem is you don't have the right context to understand whether that's still in use. So one of the things, this is why we invested a ton in building visualization into Fugue. This is one of the reasons, so that you can look at it, right? Because humans are terrible at, human brains are terrible at big lists of data, where it's like we're almost as bad at big lists of data as we are preventing ourselves from doing dumb stuff. So the visualization, though, is how we've been evolved, right? You see the tiger jumping out of the woods, right? It's not a text list. So it's a nuanced and complex topic, and it really has to do with human computer interaction as much as it has to do with data that's accumulated.
It's fascinating to watch people for the first time kind of see a visualization of their cloud environment and immediately go, wait a second, what's that right there? Like, that's not supposed to be there.
Oh, yeah.
And how did that slip through all of our, our management and security systems before? When you visualize something, the human brain can immediately spot patterns that were missed before. So we've got a couple questions here. The first is, if you have security control standards defined, such as certain public storage, scan for sensitive data, and quarantine, encrypt, de-identified data found, can these be defined and included in policy as code?
So I'll let Josh take that one, actually. I think you have a good answer for it. That's why.
Sure. In theory, yes. In practice, I'm not aware. So in theory, policy as code. So let's talk a little bit about what policy as code is in a very pragmatic sense. It is, generally speaking, querying for certain conditions, right? It is generally not, at least in sane implementations, modifying stuff. It's really identifying stuff. So anything, and the reason Fugue chose OPA, Open Policy Agent, and so did Pinterest and Netflix, and it's really becoming a standard now. We wrote our own policy language in the past, but OPA is actually quite good, much better than the XML stuff that's been sitting around forever. You can query any kind of data structure that you can get into JSON. So that particular use case you're describing should be doable, right? If, for example, there's some way to mark a data source as having PII in it, well, then definitely policy as code can point to those things and tell you about them. We at Fugue don't examine your actual data. We only look at the metadata about your environment. So that's not a feature we have. I'm not aware of anyone else who has that feature and uses policy as code there, but in theory, certainly doable.
So we have one question about open source versus vendor policy as code technologies.
Let me take a crack at that, and then I'll turn it over to Raj. You want your policy as code language to be open source. Your implementation is typically going to be commercial. These days, that's mostly in the form of a SaaS. But you want the language your developers are writing to be an open source language. Proprietary languages are not valuable career skills for developers, generally speaking, and they lock you to. They don't just lock your implementation to a vendor. They lock the skill set of your team to a vendor. And the industry does not have a great history of companies making things that have deep lock-in cheaper over time. That's not where that's going to go. It's going to get more expensive over time. So that's my thought on it. But Raj, I'm curious to what you think.
I agree with that, actually. Open source, and I'm actually a huge advocate for the the CNCF. I love the idea of the projects that are on there, and we use, I think, almost 90 to 95% of our technologies that we actually use at CWS and that we implement are generally from the CNCF or are open source in nature, regardless. I think when we look at that, especially from an educational perspective, I can bring on a developer today and tell him to learn a new technology on the CNCF or that's open source, and they'll be able to go online, go to a repository that's publicly available, find another developer with the same problem, and it will give him or her the solution. I think open source technologies for you can make the argument that open source technologies, the way that vulnerabilities are handled are great, and then some people will say, well, it's not because everybody knows the vulnerability. But I think the reality is, no matter what, if you're crowdsourcing features and development and security and compliance and knowledge, you can achieve greater products. And I think that using tools like OPA specifically for policy engines is absolutely great, and especially if it's open source.
Yeah, and just for everybody out there again, CNCF is the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. OPA is Open Policy Agent for Policy Code. At Fugue, we've developed Regula, an open source project that's built on top of OPA, specifically for infrastructure as code checks, security checks, and cloud infrastructure runtime checks. So by all means, definitely go check that out. Have another question here. Does this lead us to supporting security as a big component in the QA process?
So I think the reality is, I'm going to say yes, just for argument's sake right now. I'm just going to say yes. And big, that's where it gets a little bit complicated. The big part is where, I have some trouble with this question, because if you don't have it early on in kind of your QA cycle, you're going to have that big process at the end. So you get to choose whether you want to automate it early on in your development life cycle, so your life is easier in the QA cycle, and then you can get into production, or you could have it at the end where you're sitting and waiting to see if your application can go into production. I think the idea of automating it and having it early in your SDLC and making sure that QA is validating and not doing this huge audit work is way better than I guess its counterpart.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, we have a question that's related to number 5 here on the screen that we haven't really gotten into, but how can we measure the ROI of improving our cloud security processes? Like, what are we measuring? How can we get buy-in on this?
Well, I'm very curious to hear what Raj thinks about the using policy as code in terms of ROI versus manual processes. But before I kick it over to him, I'll say, a lot of security security generally speaking is about prevention. So when you think about ROI, that implies that the security is going to somehow make you money. Security is going to prevent you from failing. And this is actually one of the challenges security folks have is, if what did I see recently? I saw a CISO reporting to the CFO, and I thought, man, if I'm a hacker and I read that, I'm going after them, because CFOs tend to be the ones that don't want to spend money. And if the CISO is captured by the CFO, wow. Sorry if you're a CFO or a CISO working for a CFO, but security is, so what is the price of, for example, when Imperva was breached a couple of years ago, their business is still doing very well. Their CEO is gone in 2 weeks. So you have to decide, what would the ROI have been had they known about the vulnerabilities the hackers use, it's hard to exactly measure that, and I don't know if you can put it in ROI terms, but I do think you can put in ROI terms using automation versus manual processes and how much faster and cheaper. So, Raj, I'd love to hear your thoughts on it.
That's exactly it. That's where I come in with the last part of what you said, because that's where I see the ROI. As somebody who goes into a lot of enterprises and are there to help them expedite, applications into production or help them with migrations, the first thing I always get asked when I say, okay, our job is done is, wait, are you sure? Did you comply to all of these different compliance frameworks that exist in the market? And my answer is, yeah, let me go back and check. So what we do is we get a list of all of their requirements and we go through every single object, every single asset, and we manually check, or historically we used to manually check whether we were compliant or not. The way that I am able to measure our success or measure our ROI is knowing that that activity would usually take, let's say, 2-3 developers, let's say 2-3 weeks for a smaller application. With policy as code, we were able to bring that down to a couple of days max. And that's even with, the ability to do reporting against policy as code. And I think that, having that in place has greatly increased our ROI, especially from the development point of view. And I can't stress this enough. The ROI is not solely based on our increased velocity in delivering projects, but it's the amount of money that a company can save educating developers. If you can teach them passively how to do these things early on in the SDLC, the better off you will be, and you're going to see a secondary, return on investment for that. And I think that's something that people forget to capture.
Awesome.
Yeah, well put.
Yeah. Okay. We got a couple minutes left, and wanted to kind of touch on like the challenges of changing processes, changing culture, how we do things. When talking about kind of transforming how we do cloud security, that's touching on the security teams, the DevOps teams, the developers, compliance. Where are folks going to experience headwinds in trying to kind of drive this sort of change in how we do things? And what are some ways to kind of overcome that and get the buy-in needed to change how we do things?
So maybe
since you probably live this day in, day out with with your client engagements.
Yeah. Hopefully we get to cover it. I know we only have like 2 minutes and X amount of time left, but one of the things that I always tell everybody is I don't really care to listen to the other perspective, but I think it's really start from the bottom up. You need to start with the people that are impacted by this. And generally, the people that are going to be impacted by security are the people that are trying to create product to get it out, to a commercial market.
It's the
you need to start. Yeah, exactly. So you need to start with their pain points. If you can teach developers and give them the tools they need to get their product out faster and in a way that works with their workflows, the easier it's going to be to go from developers to a product manager to a some type of security lead to even a CISO or something like that. I think the reality is go to the people that are experiencing the pain, and if you start there, you're going to be able to convince an organization.
Awesome.
Yeah, I'll chime in with another factor there. When people try to solve things in software organizations top down, they rarely succeed. And they rarely succeed because it's the implementers that actually have to live with the consequences of those decisions. So what you've seen over the last 30 years that I've been in this business is it kind of went from we got 1 minute. It kind of went from the people who wrote systems also maintaining them and kind of owning them, the total ownership model now. And then everything as more and more software systems were built, it got complexified, and you had a separate ops team and this team and that team and a bunch of more layers of management. The hands-on people who are building and maintaining these systems really have to buy into the tools that are used for them to be effective. And so you can impose something. I mean, we have one of our kind of mottos at Fugue is we don't want any shelfware out there. We don't want anyone to be a customer of ours who are not actively using the product, because there's really no point to that. And the active users are the ones who most directly have good judgment on these things.
Awesome. That's a great way to end it. Thank you, Rajat and Josh, for joining us. Thank you, Brooke, for hosting us here, and for everybody joining us today. This was a lot of fun. Appreciate your questions.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much, Josh and Rajat, for presenting, and to Fugue for sponsoring today's webinar. Thanks for taking the time to present and presenting this engaging panel discussion. Yep. For those watching, you'll find a tab to rate the webinar down below the presentation screen. Please review the webinar so that we know what content you're enjoying. Right next to it, you'll find additional references and resources from today's webinar in the attachments section, including an upcoming webinar hosted by Fugue. The recording of this webinar will be available within minutes of the conclusion, and you can rewatch using the same link. Thank you, everybody, for attending, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you.